Good day and welcome everyone to the SESYNC dialogue on Indigenous knowledge and science. My name is Dr. Heidi Scott. I'm a communications associate for SESYNC and a senior lecturer at the University of Maryland at College Park. Today I'm going to be talking to Dr. Billy van Uitregt, who is a senior lecturer in the School for Geography, Environment, and Earth Sciences at the Victoria University of Wellington, which is its English name. Its Maori name is Herenga Waka, which means a place to moor your canoes. Thank you so much for being here, Billy.
Tēnā koe. Just to identify myself and my relations to the world and to landscapes. So called Billy van Uitregt tōku ingoa. So my name is Billy van Uitregt. No ahi te reiri aho. So I'm from Australia, or what is now known as Australia. No ngā raudu, te ati haunui a paparangi me ngai tūhoi hoki. So my tribal affiliations are to Ngā Raudu, which is the southernmost Taranaki iwi, to Wanganui is the next tribe, and then Tūhoi around to Uitregt, up north of the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm calling from Wanganui. I'm looking at the Wanganui River as I'm looking out my window, and I guess I draw on it for the inspiration to guide my kōrero and my words whenever I'm in meetings such as this are being recorded for educational purposes. So yeah, just put all that out there. I'm Australian born, of Māori descent and Dutch heritage through my father, hence my last name. And I was born and raised in Australia, worked with First Nations peoples after I finished my PhD, and I spent about 10 years then working with First Nations peoples, communities and organisations in Australia before moving to Aotearoa to sort of, I guess I'm a zoologist by training, but I worked with First Nations on conservation programs in Australia, and now I came to New Zealand to qualify myself, I guess. So I did a Masters of Indigenous Studies, just to give myself that sort of formal qualifications in the work that I do so that I can operate on an international level in Indigenous research fields. And now I'm a lecturer at Te Herenga Waka after doing a postdoc with Massey University and Manaaki Whenua, Land Care Research. And so all of my research and my teaching is focused on how Māori and Indigenous worldview, knowledges, voices, values, everything of those sorts is built in contemporary environmental management systems. So it's quite a broad remit, even though it might sound like it's quite small. So I find myself as a scientist having to engage in very philosophical discussions about what a knowledge tradition is or epistemological commitments. So I kind of have to position myself as ill-equipped based on my training and my natural disposition as a reductive, positivist, scientifically trained person, but also that's my natural disposition. I would say all of my philosophizing is amateur at best, but it doesn't stop me from doing it.
That's the pleasure in it, right? So I want to start our conversation just by putting out there a form of self-reflexivity, which is that I heard on the radio this morning that this date, April 26th, is the date of the so-called first landing of English colonists on the coastline that was to become America. It might have been known as Turtle Island before that. So April 26th, 1607 was the day that changed that set of continents forever. And just a few years later, in 1619, the first enslaved Africans were brought against their will from modern-day Angola to the east coast of the United States. And I was just struck by NPR presenting that history as a form of the beginning of America, and the kind of cultural blind spot that we have about the deep history of Indigenous stewardship and knowledge of this landscape of Turtle Island long before any Europeans set foot on this land. And so I would like to start our conversation just by bringing in the University of Maryland's land acknowledgement and seeing that as one way that universities have started to reckon with the erasures and the genocides of Indigenous history in the Americas. And then, maybe Billy, I'll ask you to bring a perspective from how your university treats its varied and plural cultures and brings them into dialogue with one another. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. So, we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are the ancestral stewards of this sacred land. It is their historical responsibility to advocate for the four-legged, the winged, those that crawl, and those that swim. They remind us that clean air and pristine waterways are essential to all life. This land acknowledgement is a vocal reminder for each of us two-leggeds to ensure our physical environment is in better condition than what we inherited for the health and prosperity of future generations. That land acknowledgement is something that I bring into my conversations with students who are usually don't have the advantage of having any Indigenous culture or history of any depth or value in their education up to the college level. When I ask them to think beyond the 200 or 300 year mark and into the deeper land histories and the Piscataway stewardship of the lands, there's an interest and a spark in their eyes, but little grounding, little sense of traction with what that might involve. So we're just taking baby steps at this point. We're just starting to unlearn prejudicial and exclusive histories of settler colonialism. And we're just starting to acknowledge the Piscataway. There's a new dining hall called Yahen Tamitsi, which means a place to go and eat on our campus. It is an industrial facility. It is by no means along the agricultural traditions of the varied Indigenous people of this land, but it is a beginning of recuperating some of that knowledge. So, Billy, I just invite you to share your perspective from the Southern Hemisphere and your ideas on, how the Antarctic region and the Southern Oceans might continue to benefit with ongoing evolutions and partnerships between Maori people and other Indigenous groups.
Tēnā koe, Heidi. I recognize you and thank you for inviting me to be part of this dialogue. Quite humbling. Thank you for your opening. I guess one of those stark reminders of the histories that we kind of have around the world as settler colonial nations, and a somber moment, I guess, for you guys. Now, I guess where I would start, so a land acknowledgement is certainly something I'm quite familiar with from my Australian experience, being born and raised there. And perhaps the best example I can draw on from your introduction of me is the name of our university, so Victoria University of Wellington. But the name of the university in Te Reo Māori, in the Māori language, is Te Herenga Waka. And you rightly described the translation of that to the place of to moor your canoes, right? And that the name is great in and of itself, but I think the sentiment that it represents is something that can get lost in translation. And that's where maybe I'd focus on these sorts of things of land acknowledgement in naming your warekai or your food halls as with Indigenous names. So it's really important that it's not just a name, or at least that we recognize the depth of naming and what naming means to people. So for Te Herenga Waka, yes, it's the place of mooring canoes, but it's meant to symbolize, it's the name of the marae there, which is the Māori meeting house. And that marae was established long after the university was established, and it took, I guess, some very deliberate efforts by our kaumatua or our elders down there to, I guess, negotiate for the building and establishment of that marae. And in its naming, I guess that's where we see the real importance of it. So the marae is deliberately built to recognise lots of Māori tupuna or ancestors from around the country, around the motu or the country, so that all Māori, wherever you come from, whatever tribe you come from, or whatever hapu you come from around the country, that you should be able to look around that ware, that ware nui or the meeting house, and be able to find a po, which is a carving in one of the wall panels that represents an ancestor that you connect to. So that's what it means by it's the mooring place of many canoes. So wherever you're from, you should be able to come there, tie up your canoe and belong. And that meaning, that speaks to what the name actually means. There's a far deeper sentiment than just saying Te Herenga Waka.
It is interesting to get that deeper context of the place representing a place where different people are welcome and find themselves, in a collective effort to communicate and to create together. That's beautiful. It's way better than a dock where you sling your canoe. It's much more cultural in-depth understanding. We can be too literal minded, I think, and that's what I was
exactly
wondering,
yes
right? Yeah, wonderful. A lot of people, myself included, have been inspired by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a Potawatomi tribal member and also a botanist here in North America, in Turtle Island. And she has so many eloquent and illustrative examples of ways that she's hybridized her scientific knowledge with her Indigenous knowledge. But one thing that I just wanted to bring up was the use of language and how language from a constructivist point of view would say that we're only able to perceive things that we have words for, or things that our culture has allowed us to access with these handles of nouns and verbs. And how English, though it often celebrates itself for its abundance of individual words, lacks the apparatus to detect, really amazing patterns and energies in nature. And the example that she gives is the Anishinaabe word papawi, which is the force that drives the mushroom up into the air overnight. That is the force that makes the mushroom appear where there was no mushroom the day before. And I'm a mycophile, and I have wondered at that, sudden appearance overnight of fungi. And I love this word papawi. So I would just wonder what your perspective is on the richness of perception that science has not availed itself of. And then it may even subordinate to its forms of generating information and data about the world. And what role you think language may play and being plural in our understanding of different languages and bringing in more concepts. That sounds like appropriation when I say it. Like let's take these words that are useful in other languages and bring them into English. So I'll just flag that as what it is. But what do you think, Billy?
This is a great conversation, and I do have lots to say about it. I'd probably, based on my amateur philosophizing, try and change the conversation a little bit. I think one of the constraints of the conversation in Aotearoa is that, in terms of Indigenous knowledge, or TEK, here in a local context, we call it Mātauranga Māori. So it's Māori knowledge, Māori philosophy, and there's not debates, but it's a rich, I would say, a Māori knowledge tradition to capture the philosophical element, the scientific element, the historical element, and there's, I guess, values are embedded in that knowledge tradition. So I call it Mātauranga Māori and then Mātauranga Pākehā on this side, just so that we have an equivalent conversation. And to answer your question very directly, how I think it helps to have this Mātauranga Māori and the conceptualization of it to draw on is that you can actually start to be critical about the way we think about science, or Mātauranga Pākehā. And I think by saying Mātauranga Pākehā, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek I'm trying to be provocative, sure.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about mātauranga Māori and science, what you're talking about is the apple tree and the apple. That's what you're comparing. So science is just one part of a very rich Western knowledge tradition, of which all should be brought into conversation when you're talking about mātauranga Māori or Indigenous knowledge traditions. Because it's false. I think it's very false, quite blatantly false, to equate science to the richness and the depth of the Western knowledge tradition as a whole. I think that's one of the things we can take away from having an alternative knowledge tradition, to then be reflexive about, how are we even thinking and talking about this one that seems to be that prevails in our society, in contemporary society. A second one, English language and how it constrains our ability to engage with our knowledge traditions. We're thinking about these concepts of mana and mauri. So probably don't mean that much on an international level, but for Māori, the way we think about, if we're talking about river health, we talk about the mauri of the river. We all have a mauri of our own. So it's almost like our life force or our essence when we're talking about that. And I don't know, like maybe life force is what you call it in English, but it's not that, it's like we use these English words to define it, but it's like, it's sort of that, but not really.
Okay.
And so when we're thinking about these terms, trying to get some sort of scientific measurement. So if we're talking about the health of the river, we often like to monitor the river health. How do we bring some sort of metric or reductive metric in as a representative or a representation of the mauri of the river or awa when we're trying to manage it? And that's quite a difficult piece. Like people are having a go at that. Like how do we've got measures like a mauri compass, the cultural health indices, lots of other ways that Māori communities and tribes are trying to represent that complexity of their worldview in these contemporary management systems, which often require us to have some sort of metric by which to make decisions by.
Right.
And that's an ongoing conversation where we're trying to crack that open. So what sort of processes can we build in there that might not result in a metric, like there might not be a, here's our index of mauri. There's more of a process through which the mauri is inherently built into the process of which you reach that metric, perhaps. We're trying to give effect to use policy language, give effect to these really complex suite of freshwater values. And I say freshwater, but I do mean all of environmental value. Like mana, mauri, wakapapa, which is our genealogical heritage, wakawanongatanga, so our familiar relationships to each other, and those narratives that are sort of central to our culture and cultures and identities. So how do you build that into an effective monitoring system to influence decision-making, so that those values, those really complex values that we hold that don't even really translate to English well, can actually be given effect to in the management system, but also, we say whakamana, we want to lift them up, enhance them, rather than just protect them as they are, but enhance them, dig them deeper. And I just don't think those concepts are available to us in English to be able to do that. So but the depth of meaning of these words, like Herenga Waka, is lost on me. And so that's where I find it really challenging. When I do my work, I can't do it alone. So I need to build partnerships with artists, which I work with a lot, with our tohunga, so our experts in Te Ao Māori, in Te Reo Māori, and Te Ao Māori, in the Māori worldview. I need them to, I need to be supporting them, not necessarily have them supporting me. And that, because otherwise I am missing the point a lot of the time. So it's a real constraint on my ability to engage in Indigenous knowledges.
That sounds like a really complex challenge, involving many levels of cultural and linguistic understanding, but also um, changing a worldview. You have may I say, a hybrid identity, or an identity that is both Maori and Dutch and Australian, and that fusion of them. And so you may have some proximity that a white Australian or New Zealander would not have, but you are professing your distance and the challenge still that you feel for this. And when we think about realms of existence and being, and how we can identify our body, and we can identify our minds or our cognition, we can talk about our emotions, and then we can talk about our spirituality, and how Western traditions, I'll stay with the concept of a kind of European science and position that would entertain the body and the mind as things that generate knowledge of the world, but then suppress emotion and spirituality. And I wonder whether one of the things that might bring our epistemology along as we seek coevolution, as we seek better understanding between these traditions, is to reintegrate emotion and spirituality, whatever that means to the individual and to the group, into our perception of our environment. And that would involve patience and deep perception. That might involve deep narrative traditions that don't have to do with scientific epistemology, but that have to do with folklore and origin stories. And often, in my culture at least, emotion is something to be suppressed, something not to be brought into decision making. There are ways that people make maybe misogynist statements about when emotion is affecting you. That's a problem, right? That's something that we want to be rational. We want to be led by reason. So I think it's interesting to think of ways that we might enrich and meld those four layers of being, and discover a more integrated knowledge that uses the body and the mind, but that integrates our emotions as valid reactions to the difficulties that we encounter and the joys that we encounter, and then spirituality, which may be the hardest of the four to capture. Do you see emotion and spirituality as things being brought into this work in a way that is notably a departure?
Yes. So a couple of things. I love that you brought in these words, spiritual and particularly rational. They're words that kind of plague me a little bit. But I would say that science and the practice, so science as a concept might, pursue the objective, but it's still done by people. And I know all the scientists that I work with, as objective they try and be, their personalities play into their work. The politics of their work play into it.
Right.
And just to get a bit of I guess, a recognition of Antarctica, in Antarctica, science is the main game, or peace science, right? That's the formal commitment. So what you see is you've got lots of diplomats from all around the world who come and deploy their science. In lots of ways, that science is very political. So even the science research centres are very political. So no flags are allowed in the landscape, but science research centres are.
Okay.
And so, in a way, that science is almost being deployed as a political tool to kind of stake claim, in a way. So if you can't put a flag in, write some papers and talk about how great your country is at doing research in Antarctica. I'm not the only person to critique that. In fact, some good scholars from all around the world have had that quadruple. So in that Antarctic science, there's a beautiful example, a very explicit example of how the politics of science, as done by different countries, are deployed politically. So I'd kind of leave it at that, and try and come back to this this conversation about spirituality. Again, I think it's a word that's a little bit tainted in English because it's very reflective of the non-physical elements of the world, right? And so I'll come back to the concept of mauri and wairua, which are very integral to Sao Māori, the Māori worldview. And we maybe focus on wairua, which you might say is equated to spiritual element, perhaps. So my wairua, people might say my spirit. It's my spirit, my non-physical part of me. The wairua of something or the mauri of something might be non-tangible, and I hear that word all the time as well. So it's non-physical, not tangible. You can't measure it or something like that. But I always remind people that it might be something in the non-physical world, but by the way that the mauri of this river, the Whanganui River I'm looking at right now, touches my own mauri or my wairua, influences it, means that that non-physical element of the world, the spiritual element of the world, can become physical by the way that it inspires me. And the link between my spiritual element, the non-physical element of me, and the physical element of me. So while it isn't intangible until I act upon it, the non-physical elements or the spiritual elements of the world and the physical are manifest through us. So it's almost prudent, honest, to be very cognizant that that spiritual element of the world, we are responsible for how it's manifest in the physical part of the world. And take it quite seriously and make sure that when we are making decisions, we're very cognizant of how it is, and we can't pretend that it doesn't, because I think that's just false.
Yes.
Again, I'd point, Antarctic science, perfect example of how people deploy science very politically. I don't know how, if you went to an Antarctic science meeting, you would absolutely see how these scientists come diplomats are wielding science in very deliberate ways, and their states are as well.
Okay.
Even New Zealand.
Well, thank you for that. And I, in my nascent understanding of what you're describing here, I really like the idea that we're giving animacy or physicality to a spiritual world, and a set of perceptions that, for me as a secular person, the word spirituality is highly affected by my perception of Christianity, which I don't think,
exactly. Right.
I don't think it doesn't work for me as a way of understanding our origins or our present. And so I've needed to discover spirituality outside of what my culture has taught me about it, and outside of what science has ignored and subordinated about it. And it almost at first seemed like an apologetic thing to look into. Like, I'm sorry, all of my secular schooling, but I need something more, and I feel that there is something more. And so, leaning into ecofeminism and understanding, how deep care and stewardship and systems like permaculture can give us a spiritual link to what is also physical and what is also emotional, has been has given me like a realm of existence that I hadn't had growing up in my culture. I've been also wondering about this moment, this day, this decade, 2023, the 2020s in general, and how I think a lot of us feel as though, at least here in the United States, we feel that we're in a kind of dystopian moment, environmentally speaking. We feel both the weight and the pressure of climate change and habitat degradation and mass extinction against the monolith of political intransigence and polarization. And this does not seem unrelated to the widespread loss of Indigenous knowledge and ways of approaching stewardship and care for ecosystems, not wanting to romanticize or make all Indigenous people, because obviously, Indigenous people had effects on the landscapes in which they lived, using fire and other elements to regulate them, having effects on game species and beyond. I'm wondering what you would say to somebody who feels spiritually bereft and freaked out about the violence and the technology and the technological violence and the sense that we're gonna technologize ourselves out of these problems without, bringing carbon recapture, right? Electric cars, batteries, but we're not growing as human beings by doing that. We're just increasing the apparatus and the alteration of our environment to extend this same ontology further. There are many levels to this. So how do we avert climate disaster? Well, we need the political will, but we also need the cultures that say the way we are doing things, this extraction and profit-based system is, some of the roots of this. How we can reorient our culture, and I'm again coming from an American perspective, which seems almost like the epitome of the cultures of acquisition, of extraction, and the personal and spiritual void that may represent to some people. That's it. It's not a question. It's just a big realm of inquiry, and I wonder, how you deal with, dystopia or a sense of intransigence in the political apparatus that make the policies that make for the changes or not in the way things go.
Well, I definitely don't have an answer to all of that. If I did, I'd be probably getting paid way more than I do.
Is it about money though?
No, no. Well, that's part of the problem. And maybe I'd probably touch on that because I think one of the key things I'm, I guess, grappling with is that a lot of our, discourse, particularly settler colonial Indigenous relations discourse, it often centers around power. And I think we've just been led up the garden path a little bit in terms of having that tool, that I guess theoretical tool, or to conceptualize the way we relate to each other, to the world. That I think that taints us and leads us down to an inevitability of a powered structured relationship between each other and with the landscape.
Okay.
And I'll draw on Māori concepts, particularly of mana. I talked about it before. Some people would equate it to prestige or importance. I guess I'm grappling with what it means, to be honest, having not been brought up with that. But it sort of has a partnered, oh gee, I hope I'm getting this wrong. If any Māori watch this and think I'm full of crap, let me know.
We'll get feedback.
We had this concept of mana, and some might equate it to the concept of power or authority, right? But I like to think of it as quite distinct from power, because with the idea of power, you almost have to fight for it. But with mana, it's almost intrinsically yours. And when you relate to each other and to landscape features and to the world in terms of mana, you hold your own and you let others hold theirs as well. And it's sort of partnered with this concept of manaki tanga. So this is my understanding, is mana aki tanga. So it's almost equated to hospitality in some ways. But really, I think it's about how we uplift other people's mana. So kind of look at, instead of dealing in power, which sort of almost inevitably means that someone has to be powerful and someone has to be subordinate. Right. If you deal with mana, we all roll with our own mana that's inherently ours. And it's my colleague writes about this, Krishna Watane writes about how our mana is inherently linked to others. So the way that we look after others is a reflection of our own mana.
Right.
And I think that just changes the game from a very foundational basis. If you want to talk about power and who's got power, who doesn't have power, then inevitably there's this uneven relations or perceived uneven relations. When you talk about mana, I think it's a totally different ball game, totally different conversation, and we can get further with our thinking.
We may find ourselves to be more formidable if we support others in their mana, rather than it being I win, you lose, or the more I have, the less you have.
Exactly. So again, to draw on a Māori concept, we have this kōrero, this saying, I guess, he waka eke noa. It's the canoe that we're all in together. And in that, it's not, and in that race for life, the people with the privilege got the head start and then had to finish the race. And just ridiculous thinking and so limited. So what he did is everyone's pitted against each other. Whereas this he waka, and one person wins, the rest inherently lose. But then in this concept of he waka eke noa, my winning is inherently linked to your winning. So if I don't win, you don't either.
Yeah.
And that's just a different way to conceptualize life, right? It's not a rat race. It's not a race at all.
Right.
We're on a journey together.
It's many people rowing in the same boat.
Yeah, if I don't get there, you don't get there either. And I like to draw on that Haida Gwaii example in your fellows' neck of the woods. I think it's called Haida Gwaii. There's a statue with similarly a canoe with lots of different characters built into it. And I was like, yeah, it's a similar concept. It's all these different characters get us to where we want to go.
Interesting. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I just recognize how long it has been suppressed, that as I started this conversation, that there were other, thousands of years deep knowledge traditions that have been trivialized to figures like Pocahontas, and how incomplete our education has been as Americans. And what I hope for my kids is that from me and from the public schools that they go to, that we start to bring in experiences of the non-dominant groups, of the non-hegemonic groups, as essential knowledge, not as an enrichment or a special period here and there, but as something that is essential to their being people who can navigate the world in an equitable and informed kind of a way, and to see how limited the previous worldviews have been. So there are Indigenous people from the Lenni Lenape of the Delaware to New York region and the Piscataway of our local region. I was just in North Carolina. I went to the University of North Carolina, and they're acknowledging in the Daily Tar Heel Indigenous life here at the University of North Carolina. And this young woman is a member of the Lumbee tribe down south, recuperating and recognizing that there are that these cultures are alive today, and have information, that this isn't something that's set back in time or set somewhere out west or is set in some other part of the world. And how in this place of Indigenous genocide, how do we bring those people into the conversations where other power holders — that word power seems complicated to me now — but where people who have influence on policy are truly hearing and reflecting that knowledge. So that's what I'm looking to see in coming years, as I see these universities coming along. And Billy, from your vantage and from your work in the Southern Oceans and with Maori culture and with Antarctica, what would you like to see happening over the next 10, 20, 50 years in terms of integrating knowledge, in terms of coevolution, in terms of shared governance?
I guess probably the main thing that I'd like to see is that people, and I'm going to just be critical of academia right now, is that we return to our ways of curiosity. It seems like since starting my honours research, my academic mentors were just inherently curious people. So they didn't naturally deploy their knowledge as power. Or I think in some ways, in my experience, it has become that. Universities are money-making machines, and their commodity is students partially, but also knowledge. I'd like to see knowledge decommodified, and the way that we think and talk about it as not something to shift. So, you know, people talk about knowledge construction. I was like, oh, I'm not sure you constructed that, you just became aware of it. That in that construction comes a sense of ownership, and commodification almost. We're selling it off, and I hear people talk about that all the time. I'd like, you know, scholarship to sort of return to just innately curious people trying to understand the world without a sense of one-upmanship, with a sense of mana, perhaps, rather than engaging with it through a concept of power.
Right.
And I think that for me would be golden, because I have to, when I rock up to give presentations, even at my own university, I'm very deliberate, and I use, I'm a big fella, I use my size, and I say, we're all here for a dialogue, because I often have community research partners in the room who are nervous as hell, never presented to anyone, let alone professors. And I want to change that adversarial engagement in knowledge. Yeah. Critical, all good, but not adversarial. Right. Knowledge is deployed for political purposes too much, I think, and it taints the way we view the world. Yeah. So I think for me, that would be the main thing, is that we reconceptualize knowledge a little bit, really engage with what Herenga Māori is, or Indigenous knowledges are, the humility that's sort of required to engage with them well. I'd love to see that return to our hegemonic academic systems, and I think the world will just be nicer and better. I feel like
Absolutely.
my experience,
oh my goodness,
yeah,
that word humility, I don't think that's gotten much airing recently.
Hasn't had much of
in
a
academic
show.
circles, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, you know, again, a sense, and maybe, you know, I could oversimplify this by suggesting, you know, open source knowledge, you know, articles free to view for besides paywalls, like as a superficial example of what you mean, like that. How do we share?
Fundamental ones, though. Fundamental examples as well. Yes.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so we're having this conversation using SESYNC's platform, and SESYNC is an NSF grant, but all of our learning resources are available for free to anybody in the world. And so I hopefully we're in the right spirit of mana here. Yes. And, you know, I think that we've got a long way to go when it comes to taking the ego and the egotistical I out of the motivation for work at universities. So that's a whole other conversation that we won't get into right now, Billy. But you know, thank you so much for spending this hour with me. And you know, it's been wonderful to see the sunrise of tomorrow through this screen behind you, as things fade on my day. And if there's any way that I or SESYNC or the University of Maryland can provide insight or support or co-discovery with what you're doing down there, you know, consider us friends and allies.
Awesome. Thank you, Epwa. I really appreciate the invite, or the tono, to participate in this dialogue with you. It certainly enriched my understanding of the world, hearing your own kōrero, or your own conversation.
Cutting across two hemispheres and many cultures besides. So
that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thank you, Billy. Goodbye.
Fantastic.